I brought this painting from home, and it's a picture. I know you're feeling me, aren't you? Fellow fan. This is a picture of Middle Earth. If you're familiar with Tolkien, any works by Tolkien like The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, we are uber nerds at our house, massive Tolkien fans. So I had to prove to the extent that we are Tolkien fans. This used to hang over our bed. Like, we're big Tolkien fans. Okay, and so we love the stories, we love the movies. I've read the books multiple times. I've read some of Tolkien's works. They're like my go-to place when my brain just wants to slip away and escape. So I wanted to share with you a picture of the Fellowship. Indulge me here for a moment. Okay, so this is a picture from the Fellowship of the Ring. It's the first movie in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and these are the main characters. They're referred to as the Nine Companions, or the Fellowship of the Ring. And in this picture, we have an elf, we have two men, a wizard, a dwarf, and four hobbits. People coming from all over those kingdoms, different various people groups, and they come together for a purpose. And they look very placid in this picture, but right before this moment, it was very tense in the movie. There was apprehension and questioning and disbelief, disgust, contempt, fighting, and distrust. And but this moment is the moment of their commissioning of their quest. They've come together for a purpose. They've come together to save the world, to save Middle Earth. And when I read our text for today, which is actually in Acts 10, 9 through 23, it reminded me of this moment, the moment the fellowship was commissioned for their quest. See, at the beginning of Acts 10, we have a man, his name is Cornelius. Cornelius is a Roman, he's a military man, a military leader, and he has a visit from an angel of the Lord. And that angel tells him to send for Peter, who is a Jewish Christian fisherman. Cornelius and Peter belonged to two very different cultures. They ate different things. They wore different things. They had a different history. Their ancestors spoke different languages and worshiped differently. In Peter's culture, he was taught that in order to remain purely God's chosen people, he wasn't allowed to eat with, he wasn't allowed to associate with anyone outside of his culture. That was what he was taught and raised to believe. And Cornelius was taught that he was a Roman and therefore the best, an elite class of people. So God just spoke to Cornelius to send for Peter, to cross the barrier. So Cornelius sends two of his slaves and a soldier to go get Peter. And that's where we are today in our story, in Acts 10. So I'm going to be reading out of, in this story, I'm going to be reading out of the NRSV. So it's going to maybe look a little different than your pew Bibles, but if you want to choose to follow along there, or you can follow along on the screen. So here is verse 9 of Acts 10. At noon the next day, so this is the day after Cornelius' vision with the angel. So about noon the next day, as they, the two slaves and the soldier, were on their journey and approaching the city. So here they come, they're approaching the city. Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat. And while it was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw the heaven open and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its four corners. In it were all kinds of four-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. Then he heard a voice saying, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I've never eaten anything that's profane or unclean. Peter is praying and he sees a vision. He has an encounter with the divine. And just a few verses earlier, Cornelius is praying and has an encounter with the divine. The Spirit is up to something. The Spirit of God is the active agent in our story, in this story. While Peter's culturally appropriate meal is being prepared, the heavens open, and down comes a sheet with animals on it. Animals in which Peter has been taught his whole life not to eat. These words, that the heavens open, they harken back to imagery of Jesus' baptism in Matthew 3:16, where the heavens open and then the Spirit comes and descends upon Jesus as a dove. Similar language there, the heavens opening and then something descending from heaven. This is a moment where heaven touches earth. This is a moment where heaven is touching earth. It's a divine disruption. The voice from heaven tells Peter to literally sacrifice. Our English Bibles tell us that it's to kill, but the Greek word here is sacrifice. So this is like Peter's religious language. So the Spirit is saying, sacrifice, and eat what all of Peter's life he's been told to avoid like the plague, to be disgusted at, to expel from his life, to turn from. Peter says, man, by no means, Lord, for I've never eaten anything that's profane or unclean. Everything that Peter thought was good and right, holy and clean, all of this defined who he was and who his community was. When God called the people of Israel to be his chosen people, he indicated, and we can read it in Leviticus 11, a very specific diet that would separate them from the communities that were surrounding them. So this was a way for the people of Israel to obey God, to be holy, to be the chosen people of God. This was who Peter was. And God interjected into Peter's meal preparation with divine hospitality, like a holy tablecloth coming down from the sky, in an invitation to eat what God has offered. And Peter doesn't know what to do with it. I think that's fair. We all have been raised by a group of people, in a group of people, to think certain ways about certain circumstances, ways of being, food, music, stories, clothes, places, churches, religions, cultures. It's just how we're raised. I was thinking about this, like, in our culture, you wear certain things to the beach that you would never wear to the boardroom. You would listen to a song and like rock out to it in your car, but if that song was played in church, you're like, that's uncomfortable. So we're just raised to think certain things, certain ways about certain experiences. Another way to think about it is, how often do I use the word we, us, or them? It's totally natural for humans to categorize, to sort, to make sense of the world in this way. Actually, it's a healthy thing to be attached to a group of people. It's like part of human nature and human development. We think of attachment to parents and family. Like that's part of healthy development. When we think about our us, it's usually defined by certain characteristics. For me, apparently, I would consider myself a Tolkien fan. So that's part of my us. Fellow Tolkien fans, I see you. So, right? Like we're the us, you know? I think of teachers because I used to be a teacher. Women, tall people, curly-haired people, mothers, white people, college-educated people, straight people, Christians. This is when I use the word us. So what's yours? How do you categorize yourself? Like, how do you make sense of that? What's your us? And so if there's an us on one side, there's a them on the other side of that coin. What we don't like, what we don't associate with, what we just don't categorize ourselves as. This is usually them. So thinking about this, like just to kind of try to get our brains spinning about like who is our them? What type of food would you never eat? That's kind of easy for me because I don't really like meat, so I got a list. But what food would you never eat? What type of music would you never listen to? What type of clothing do you think is just in poor taste or inappropriate? What people do you find the most offensive? It's important to consider that what we think is appropriate and even holy may actually be constructions of our culture more than God's directive. It's important that we consider that what we think is appropriate and even holy may actually be constructions of our culture more than God's directive. Imagine you're in Peter's place. Oh my goodness. Imagine you're just sitting alone with God, praying. It's sacred. It's this holy moment. And then bam, right in front of your eyes, the food, the music, the clothing, the people, whatever makes you the most uncomfortable is sitting right in front of you, and God says, eat, dance, hang out, put it on, become friends. What are you feeling? I don't know about you, but I'm thinking, but I'm not supposed to do that. This makes me really uncomfortable. So let's look back at Acts 10. Now I'm in verse 15. We're in verse 15 to see how God responds to Peter's unwillingness to eat what he has prepared for him. So here we are in verse 15. The voice said to him, to Peter, again, a second time, what God has made clean, you must not call profane. This is a gnomic statement in Greek. It's a timeless truth. Like I know that at the traditional service they do this. Sometimes this phrase is used from the Bible: the grass withers and the flowers fade, but the word of the Lord endures forever. That's a gnomic truth. It's this timeless truth. It's like that. What God has made clean, you must not call profane. What God has made. Throughout this section, I kept thinking, geez, this is really reminding me of Genesis 1. There's this repeated thing that happens 3 times in this whole section. These words, the next day. The next day happens after something really big. So Cornelius has a vision. The next day is said. Peter has a vision. The next day. This keeps happening. It feels like, if you're familiar with Genesis 1, it's, and God made the heavens and the earth, evening and morning, the second day, the first day. Honestly, I don't know the days, I'm sorry. But there's like a day, and there's a proclamation of the day, right? That's what this feels like. Cornelius has a vision the next day. It feels grand. It feels creational. There's something stirring here that's creational. Then the words, what God has made clean. What God has made. In Genesis 1, there is no clean or unclean. There's just good. Everything that floats down on that sheet, the 4-footed animals, the reptiles, the birds. In Genesis 1, God declared, this is good. This is good. Then in Genesis 2, God gives Adam a job, and he gives him the job of naming the animals. This is the human's work, naming. God instructs Peter's naming in Acts 10 with these words, what God has made clean, you must not call profane. In John 13, Jesus washes Peter's feet. And he washes his feet and he says to him, you are clean, Peter. You are clean. Sometimes we look at people's exterior, their behavior, and we make the judgment on behalf of God of what is clean and what is not clean. And often it has more to do with our cultural or our preferences than it has to do with gospel. Our offense is not a reliable standard for godliness. Our offense is not a reliable standard for godliness. Jesus declares who is clean. God is the one who says who is clean. The story becomes more about food because we know that food, like behind food, stands the person who made it, right? So this story is going to move beyond food into people. So here we are now in Acts 10, verse 16. This happened 3 times. And I just learned this on Friday, that when something happens in Jewish culture 3 times, it becomes a pattern. It's now like set in motion. So this happened 3 times, and the thing was suddenly taken up to heaven. And while Peter was greatly puzzled about what to make of the vision that he had just seen, suddenly the men sent from Cornelius appeared, of course. They were asking for Simon's house and were standing at the gate. They called out to ask whether Simon, who was called Peter, was staying there. And while Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, look, 3 men are searching for you. Now get up, go with them, or go down and go with them without hesitation, for I have sent them. God says, I have sent them. The same word that we use for apostles, this is that word send in the verbal form. It's like God says, I apostled them. I sent them. So these people that were different than Peter, that he was taught to not associate with, were sent not from just Cornelius, they were sent from God. Verse 21, so Peter went down to the men and said, I am the one you are looking for. What is the reason for your coming? They answered, Cornelius, a centurion, a righteous and God-fearing man who is well spoken of by the whole Jewish people, who was directed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his house and hear what you have to say. So Peter invited them in and gave them lodging. We're like, oh, that's nice. That's big. Peter invited these Gentile men, these non-Jewish people, the people that he was taught, you cannot let them in your house. He invited them into the house and gave them lodging, which in that Greek again is this, he entertained them as guests. What's crazy here is this isn't Peter's house. He's a guest. This is Simon the tanner's house. So who's the guest? Who's the host? I don't know what's happening. All these lines are blurred. They're just blurred in this story. It's like a holy eraser taking, like erasing the lines of hierarchy and social status, just deleting it. Everyone's paradigm of in and out and us and them, it's all getting shaken and remade. And the next part of the story starts like this. This is the second half of verse 23. The next day, he got up and went with them, and some of the brothers and sisters from Joppa accompanied him. He went with them. So off they go. Off they go. This fellowship. I have to show you the picture again because this is like, I can almost hear the theme song in my head. So, like the fellowship. They're on a quest. But this is what I imagine in my head, these Gentiles and these Jews taking their day-long trip to Caesarea together. Maybe they probably didn't look like that, but that's what I have in my head. But this is a big deal. And the Spirit made it so. This wasn't human decision. This is the Spirit doing something. Right here in verse 24, we have the verse 23, we had the final, the next day. And, that's right, this is the third one. The third one, so we have Cornelius has a vision the next day. Peter has a vision, we just read that in 23, the next day. Then they arrive in Caesarea, the fellowship arrives in Caesarea the next day. The next day, God is making something new. In this section, the fellowship is now the guest in Cornelius' house. Peter stepped out of his culture and went into the world of Cornelius. And it's in this space, Cornelius' home, that Peter sees the Spirit encounter Cornelius and his whole household. See, Peter isn't bringing Jesus. I think we as Christians were taught, I was taught, that when I left the church, I would bring Jesus to the world. And I'm starting to realize, wait a minute. He's already there. The Spirit is at Cornelius' house. Who has the vision first? Cornelius. Peter's catching up to what the Spirit is already doing. He's joining the Spirit. The Spirit is just doing this generous, gracious work. And Peter, he's like, I don't want you to miss this. Come with me. I want you to see something. He isn't bringing Jesus, he's joining him. Cornelius and his whole house is filled with the Spirit. New life, new community, new us. The Spirit is remaking and expanding, and he did it through hospitality. Imagine what Peter would have missed if he hadn't joined the fellowship and gone on the journey. This is where we get to see God, in these intersections of people who are different than us. The people that honestly most offend us, that ruffle us, that their food disgusts us, that we're turned off by it, by what people wear or think or how they behave. These are the spaces where God confronts our constructed sense of us, and then he sets us free. And he opens us up to the other, the them. See, because being a host is a beautiful thing, but it's not enough. Because when I'm a host, when we're the host, we have all the power. We get to choose how it goes. We get to choose what we eat. We get to choose where it happens, when it happens, what we watch, what we think, what is said. That's the host gets to do the choosing. But when we're the guest, this is where transformation happens. Peter is God's guest when God lowers the sheet down and says, eat. Peter is Simon the tanner's guest. Peter is Cornelius's guest. He's entering into someone else's space humbly, curiously, willing to learn, willing to fail and make a mistake that's super embarrassing. He's willing. And this is the humility of Christ. Jesus says to his apostles when they're having this conversation about following him, and they're always a little more zealous than maybe he wants them to be about that, because he's like, it's going to cost you things. But he said, I don't have a home here. I have nowhere to lay my head. Jesus walked this earth as a guest, the King of the universe. The King of the universe walked this earth as a guest. He kept humbling himself and posturing himself as a guest. Can we, like Peter, be open to God's hospitality to respond to what and whomever he puts in our path? Can we, like Peter, let others that offend us, can we let those people into our homes, into our lives? Can we, like Peter, go with them? Say yes to an invitation to come into someone else's home, someone else's culture, someone else's life, someone else's pain, their sorrow, their injustice. Come into it. Sit down. Become a listener, a kind, humble, respectful guest. For me, I resonate with being the other a little bit. As a woman, a female pastor, I had a journey just finding a seminary that would take me. I got laughed at by registrar's office because I told them I wanted to be a pastor. I know what it's like, a little bit at least, to be on the outside, to be the them. And for me, I've just made this personal commitment. Now, this is just my conviction. This is where I'm at. But this year, I'm going to make myself a them. I'm going to put myself in places and spaces where I don't fit, where I feel like I'm on the outside. I don't get what's going on. I don't know the language. I don't know the culture. I don't get it. I'm going to put myself there. I'm going to attend events like Imago Day, like Juneteenth, like the Oneida Powwow, where I kind of feel like I'm going to say something that's really embarrassing, or I'm going to do something inappropriate and I'm going to have to apologize because I don't get how it goes. I'm going to keep doing it. I'm going to keep doing it. And I want to say yes the next time someone from Grace of Salvation asked me to dinner. The other day, a woman did, and I couldn't come, and I'm kicking myself. That was an encounter. I missed it. I want to keep saying yes to my relationship. I have a new formed friendship with some of the members of the Knesset Synagogue. Yes. I have a friend who goes to Spanish Mass at St. Willibrad's. She invited me come. Yes. I'm going to sit through that hour and not know a thing of what they said, but I'm saying yes. Yes. And it's because I want to meet Jesus there. And I want him to transform me. I want him to break down my constructed sense of us and them and make a brand new family in my brain. Make a brand new us. And this feels like the next faithful step for me. So what's your sense of discomfort or being offended or disgusted or turned off? Maybe God is calling you right there. What God has made clean. Oh, Spirit, may we never call profane. May God change us through the Spirit's work of hospitality. Amen.